Hi there, my name is Nick Sutton and I'm a freelance video director, editor and scriptwriter, and I've been working in the creative industries for about 25 years. And I'm delighted to be offered now my first ACC film. The title of the film I'll be working on for you is First Aid, Awareness and Basic Principles, and it's a UK only programme. Now, the learning outcomes for this video are, firstly, define first aid and recognise a first aid emergency, recall the key actions to be taken in a first aid emergency, and explain why debriefing and post-incident support is essential for those involved in emergency first aid situations. The production team and I had a creative meeting last week and it went very well. We discussed the aims and outcomes of the video, and I think we came up with a nice, simple but effective creative idea that will help get the messages across to the viewer. The aim of the video is to simply provide awareness and not training in first aid practices and procedures. It's to give the care home worker confidence that in any given situation there are actions and procedures that they can go through that will provide support in any given situation. And it's important to note that in this film we're not just dealing with care home workers, we are dealing with other people in the care home, such as maintenance workers, domestics, and even a resident who may be visiting the care home. The aim of this video is to recognise a first aid emergency situation and to be able to take the appropriate action. Also, we'll be looking at post-incident support, how important it is to debrief, and how important it is to recognise the emotional reaction that one may have to any given emergency situation. What will the viewer learn? Well, that there are basic actions that we can all take in any given situation. What we should do. Based on HSE recommendations, we have come up with 4 basic steps that you can take, and the viewer will be educated around these 4 basic steps. Now, these 4 steps are: 1. Assess the situation and call for help. 2. Make the area safe. 3. Check for unconscious casualties. 4. Take the appropriate action. The final step will change each time depending on the emergency situation encountered. And we will also be covering what to do in specific first aid emergencies such as a heart attack or a stroke. So what film techniques are we going to use? Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that we have an excellent medical expert on hand, Anne Holland. Anne, apart from being a triage nurse, a freelance medical consultant, a medical insurance consultant, and a Skills for Care registered first aid trainer, is a very experienced public speaker and presenter. And I think she's going to be fantastic on camera. Really, really good. And she's going to hold the film together. She's going to be the glue that joins all the various pieces together. She's going to present to camera, she's going to conduct interviews with care home workers in a debrief session, she is going to guide us through some demonstrations, and she's going to do voiceover and narration. So we will be using voiceover, narration, presenter-led pieces. We'll be using text on screen to provide bullet points and remind the viewer of certain points and messages that we've put across. We'll also, at the end of the film, be showing a debrief session. Now this is very important because here we're going to listen to actual care home workers, listen to their actual verbatim stories, and we're going to get a real insight into how care home workers react. And in fact, we're going to learn that, whatever the experience you have is, sharing those feelings and those emotions and those reactions to a first aid emergency situation is important. It's important to keep records and notes about feelings and responses and what happened on the day. And that's very important to move on. So that brings me on to the final technique that we'll be going to be using in this film, and that is dramatisation, or reconstructions as you were. And these are going to basically play a major part in the film. And this is also where we have our kind of creative idea that I mentioned earlier. The dramatic subtitle for the film, or the hook as it were, is "What would you do?" And this line will be repeated a number of times throughout the film. It's placing the viewer in the situation, asking them the questions. What would they do in this emergency situation? And we hope that that will be a very engaging way of getting people to think about the actions that they should take. Let's get to the drama though. The film opens on our main protagonist, a woman called Jane. She's a care home worker, but it's her first week in the job and she's a little nervous. We want to engage the viewer so that they really feel they can relate to Jane. So we want to use a Steadicam or a Ronin, or some people call a gimbal, to follow her on her way to work as she approaches the care home and on into reception. Once she's in reception, she sees a visitor who's come to visit a relative. We need to clock this person because they will appear later in a dramatic reconstruction. She then goes on to chat to the receptionist, who asks her how she's doing in her first week of work, and in the process is putting up a sign indicating who the first aider is for that day. And that's another important piece of information that we will clock. Jane then moves on. We follow her, again using the Steadicam Ronin, down the corridors. She'll pass other members of staff, for instance a kitchen worker, a maintenance worker, maybe even another resident. All these people we need to clock because they will all appear in dramatic reconstructions later in the film. Of course, these dramatic reconstructions don't all happen on the same day. That would be a very bad working day for any care home worker. No, we will indicate that these happen on different days with text on screen. Jane then goes into a handover meeting with other staff, and other aspects of first aid are covered in this meeting before Jane heads out on her bedroom rounds. Now here the drama really starts. She approaches a resident's bedroom and she goes in. And just as she goes in, the resident collapses on the floor for an unknown reason. Jane is shocked. She rushes towards the resident, and as she does so, the film slows down until it stops in a freeze frame. We're going to shoot this at a very high frame rate, so this slowing down will be nice and smooth and stylish. As it comes to a freeze frame, text appears on screen and asks the question, "What would you do?" And various options will then appear on screen. But we leave Jane frozen, because Anne appears on screen now. She reassures us that we will return to Jane's scenario and we will find out what she does later in the film. But first, she wants us to consider what is a first aid emergency. We now follow Anne through the care home as she walks and talks to camera, asking us to consider what is a first aid emergency, that we must also take into account our own organisation's procedures and policies, before she then guides us through a number of dramatic scenarios, examples of what first aid emergencies could happen in a care home. Firstly, another resident. Secondly, a visitor to the care home. And lastly, a staff member, such as a kitchen worker or member of the maintenance staff. The scenario of dealing with unconscious casualties is also covered in this way, culminating in dealing with an unconscious non-breathing casualty. We will also cover the ABC model, broken bones, heart attack and stroke. After each scenario, Anne will provide us with a commentary and assessment of how the staff member reacted before taking us on into the next situation and scenario. Anne will always be shot on the move or with a shallow depth of field, so hopefully our film will always have a stylish, contemporary, modern visual feel. I'll also shoot some nice, stylish blurs and cutaways, so it'll always feel like we're in the environment of the care home. Before we finally return to Jane, and we pick up the action as she approaches resident A's bedroom as at the beginning of the film. But this time she clocks the ADRT information on the door. The resident collapses and she rushes in, but she does everything to the letter. She has learned as we have learned through the film. There are no freeze frames and she conducts the procedures perfectly. Anne, now in VO, congratulates Jane and introduces us to the importance of a debrief session and of recording information about particular first aid emergency situations. So the last part of the film is a debrief session. Anne guides us through the session with real care home workers and Jane present as well. And now we get some verbatim stories. And I think this is really important because now we're going to engage with real life stories, the real life experiences of care home workers. And I think this will offer us much more of an emotional impact to not only the importance of debriefing and of sharing and of recording information, but also just how feelings of anxiety or stress around a situation are normal, and it's good to talk. The final play out of the film follows Jane as she approaches the care home again at the start of a new day. And we follow her through reception and on down the corridor, where she bumps into resident A. And they chat and smile and reflect on Jane's actions in the emergency situation and her ability, and thus hopefully ending on an upbeat note. So I guess the creative twist in this film is the playing of time, the slowing down of time, the freeze frames, hopefully engaging the audience in the situations themselves and always asking them, what would you do?